Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. The spring sun filtered through the pines as Raymond Holloway drove through the gates of Crescent Pines for the first time. He sought peace, a fresh start away from the city's chaos. But in this picture-perfect community, rules mattered more than people. He had no idea his home would soon become a battlefield for freedom. Raymond Ray Holloway first caught sight of his new home through the iron gate of Crescent Pines on a bright, cool morning in early spring. After 30 years in the crowded suburbs outside of Raleigh, he had dreamed of a peaceful retreat, a place far removed from incessant traffic and the relentless hum of city life. The sprawling community in North Carolina promised immaculate lawns, lush pines, and the tranquil hush of upper-class suburbia. It was, on the surface, exactly what he needed after retiring as an engineer. A tall stone marker announced Crescent Pines in swirling copper script just beyond the gate. Ray marveled at the rows of uniform houses with well-tended flower beds, their shutters painted in various shades of gray, tan, and white. At the heart of this community, he had found a large, craftsman-style home, a two-story dwelling of warm earth tones perched on a gentle slope. He imagined quiet weekends on the expansive back porch, tinkering with small carpentry projects in his workshop, maybe even starting a vegetable garden. But in the weeks following his move, Ray discovered that Crescent Pines was overseen by a meticulous and demanding homeowners association. A welcome packet placed neatly in his mailbox on the first day contained a thick pamphlet of bylaws and guidelines that covered everything from hedge height to acceptable mulch colors. Ray, exhausted from unpacking, barely glanced at the dense print. He assumed these rules were standard fare. Keep your yard tidy, no excessive noise, that sort of thing. Only when he began receiving notifications labeled HOA warning did he realize how serious the community was about its aesthetics and regulations. The first few letters seemed almost comical. They chided him for having shutters that were incorrect in hue and recommended a more muted color to remain consistent with Crescent Pines' tranquil environment. Another informed him that his lawn needed to be cut no higher than 2 inches and that his current height was unacceptable. Yet another complained that his garbage bins were visible from the street on non-collection days. Annoyed but wanting to cooperate, Ray adjusted his mowing schedule. He tried to tuck the garbage bins behind a cluster of shrubs. Still, each time he complied, a new issue arose. It was as if the very sight of his home offended some invisible council of judges. Soon enough, he discovered there was indeed such a council, a single person, in fact. Linda Hayward Veer, the HOA president. Linda was a tall woman with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and a gaze as sharp as the click of her designer heels. She made her rounds in Crescent Pines with the unwavering authority of a monarch surveying her kingdom. Ray's first encounter with her was on a warm Saturday morning when she appeared in his driveway carrying a clipboard. She offered a cold handshake and introduced herself with a hint of triumph. "Ah, Mr. Holloway, finally we meet," she said, tapping her pen against a stack of papers. "I'm here to discuss a few minor issues regarding your property." Linda rattled off a list. The color of Ray's shutters, apparently a too bright sage green, did not meet the approved color palette. The grass in certain patches of his lawn seemed overgrown. The presence of his recycling bin on the side of the house was not harmonious with the neighborhood aesthetic. Ray, who had faced much tougher adversaries during his engineering career, tried to be polite. He promised to repaint the shutters eventually, though his finances were still recovering from the move. He defended the recycling bin's location, explaining that it was the most practical place. Throughout it all, Linda maintained a taut smile that never reached her eyes. She left with a warning. If he failed to comply, there would be fines. An astonishingly high amount, if the bylaws were to be believed. He stood in his driveway, watching her walk off. It was only the beginning of a storm he never intended to invite. Over the next several weeks, the few minor issues expanded into a laundry list of infractions. Linda's letters arrived in crisp, white envelopes, each typed in formal language that reminded Ray of corporate memos. The shutters had to go. The mailbox, an old cast-iron piece Ray had taken pride in restoring, was labeled inconsistent with neighborhood standards. He was advised to replace it with a tasteful modern design in neutral tones. A towering oak tree in his backyard also came under scrutiny, though Ray had no idea how a tree could violate anything. Linda insisted it needed heavy trimming because it disrupted the unified landscape style Crescent Pines prided itself on. Ray's refusal to replace his mailbox triggered a weekly fine. His refusal to trim the oak, which soared far above rooftops and provided wonderful shade for reading on the weekends, brought him a letter threatening legal action. He began to feel anxious every time he checked the mail, bracing himself for whatever new complaint Linda would invent. Then came the morning he discovered his fence, which he had carefully painted in a warm cedar tone, mysteriously transformed overnight. Someone had splashed it with a dull beige paint. In broad daylight, it looked absurd, a patchy mismatch of cedar and beige. Furious, Ray stepped into his yard, only to find a fresh HOA notice pinned to the gate. It cited him for an unapproved fence color and indicated a stiff fine for non-compliance. Outraged, he tried to approach neighbors for support. Some listened politely, but their eyes darted around as though Linda might be lurking behind a hedge. Others mumbled that it's best not to stir the pot. One man who quickly ushered Ray off his porch whispered that Linda had once circulated false reports about a family's dog being dangerous, effectively forcing them to rehome the pet in order to avoid a more serious conflict with the HOA. Realizing the depth of Linda's influence, Ray felt a knot tighten in his stomach. These were not minor annoyances. This was a power play. He could either capitulate or fight back. His experience in engineering had taught him to value logic and rules, but he also understood that sometimes those in power manipulated the rules to control people. The fines escalated. First, $50 a day for the fence color fiasco, then $100 for the mailbox. In a single month, if one were to add it up, Ray could be looking at thousands of dollars in penalties. One Friday evening, a final envelope arrived with an ominous tone. The HOA threatened to pursue legal proceedings if Ray did not meet its demands immediately. The letter was on official stationery, with Linda's neat signature at the bottom. A dull panic settled in his chest. Fighting such a case would be time-consuming and expensive. Did he really want to take on the entire HOA? Yet he refused to be bullied. That night, Ray paced around his living room, formulating a plan. He would gather evidence of the fence vandalism. He would keep a record of every letter and every conversation with Linda. If Linda wanted a war, Ray would at least defend himself with facts and reason. One of Linda's tactics was to call emergency HOA board meetings whenever she found a new angle to pressure Ray. Late one afternoon, Ray returned from a trip to the hardware store to find a neon pink flyer taped to his front door, titled Urgent Community Notice. It stated that due to pressing safety concerns, the HOA had designated Ray's private driveway for potential emergency access by the community. He had to read it 3 times to absorb the absurdity. The driveway, which led exclusively to his front door, was apparently part of a new safety corridor, or so Linda claimed. The flyer demanded he keep the driveway unobstructed, meaning no gate, no private signage, no barriers that might impede an ambulance or fire truck if it ever needed to pass through. Ray's driveway was at the far edge of Crescent Pines, separated from the main loop of houses by a large row of cypress trees. The notion of it being an emergency corridor made no sense. There was no feasible route from his driveway to any other property. "That's it," Ray muttered, crumpling the flyer in frustration. He decided to take serious action. If the HOA could just designate his personal property for public use, there was nothing to stop them from making more outrageous claims in the future. So he installed a pair of sturdy metal gates at the entrance to the driveway. They were tall enough to discourage trespassers, but not ostentatious. In Ray's eyes, they were a practical necessity. He also spent a weekend attaching security cameras discreetly above the gates. As a final touch, he posted a small sign reading "Private property of residents only," wanting no confusion about who had rights to pass through. Each clang of his hammer felt like a declaration of independence, even though he suspected Linda would never stand for this. Neighbors peered out from behind curtains, curious about the construction, but too wary to approach. A few gave him sympathetic smiles, as if to say, "We wish we had the courage to do the same." By Sunday night, the gates were installed and the cameras were operational. Ray double-checked the feed on his phone app, verifying that everything worked smoothly. He slept more peacefully than he had in weeks, convinced that he had finally drawn a line in the sand. His sense of security did not last long. Monday morning brought a knock on the new gates. Ray walked outside to find Linda flanked by two members of the HOA board. Each wore a similar expression, part smugness, part outrage. Linda's voice echoed off the metal bars. "Open these gates at once," she demanded. "You have no right to block what is effectively communal property." She tapped her clipboard again. "This is your final warning." Ray calmly approached, arms folded. "This driveway is on my deed, Linda. It's mine, and unless the city seizes it by eminent domain, which they won't, it stays private." One of the board members glanced at Linda, uncertain. She cleared her throat, brandishing a letter with an official-looking seal. "We will call the police if you do not comply. You're in direct violation of an HOA directive and interfering with Crescent Pines emergency protocols." Ray shrugged, though he felt anxiety grip his stomach. "Call them then. I've done nothing illegal." Linda held her phone to her ear almost immediately, her words coming out like sharp bullets. "Yes, officer, we have a resident here, refusing to allow necessary access, threatening the community standards." Within 15 minutes, two police cruisers pulled up outside the gates, lights flashing. A small crowd of neighbors gathered from a safe distance, some whispering among themselves, others leaning in to watch the confrontation unfold. Ray opened the gates at the officer's request, letting them drive onto his property. One officer, a stoic man with graying hair, asked to see Ray's property documents. Linda tried to interject, waving her own paperwork. The officer politely but firmly told her to wait. Ray retreated inside, returning with a folder containing his deed, the property line survey, and all correspondence from the HOA regarding his driveway. The officer studied each paper carefully, flipping pages, checking signatures and official seals. Finally, he closed the folder and turned to Linda. "Ma'am, everything here confirms that this driveway is private property. The homeowner is within his rights to install gates." Linda's expression hardened. "But he's blocking a designated emergency route. This is about safety." The officer raised an eyebrow. "I don't see any official city documentation designating this as a public route. Your HOA documents don't override the county or city's property records." He handed the folder back to Ray. "We won't be citing him for anything." Ray exhaled in relief, but Linda's anger radiated off her in waves. "I will see you in court," she snarled, before storming off. The small entourage of board members trailed after her, leaving Ray to apologize to the officers for the inconvenience. That night, Ray felt both victorious and unsettled. He had stood up to Linda in a very public manner, which meant there might be payback. His hunch was confirmed just after midnight when an alert on his phone warned of movement at the driveway gate. Rushing outside, he saw a figure in dark clothes kneeling by the gate, sparks flying from a buzzing tool. Ray shouted, "Hey! Get away from there!" The intruder startled, dropping the tool with a metallic clank. In the dim glow of the motion sensor, Ray couldn't make out the person's features, but he saw them scramble toward a waiting car, which peeled away. The entire episode lasted only seconds. His cameras had caught it all, though the footage showed only a blurred silhouette. There was no conclusive evidence of identity, but Ray had a chilling suspicion of who might have orchestrated the sabotage. The next morning, Ray set about repairing minor damage left behind by the late-night intruder, a half-cut hinge bracket and scorched metal from the power tool's sparks. While inspecting the fence line nearby, he noticed a patch of disturbed earth at the base of a tall shrub, as though someone had hastily scooped and replaced soil. Pieces of broken roots stuck out in odd directions. Curiosity piqued, Ray fetched a small shovel. He dug carefully, expecting perhaps an attempt to undermine the fence posts. But after only a few inches, the tip of the shovel scraped against something solid. He cleared away more dirt, revealing a rusty rectangular metal container. It had no markings except for deep scratches and flaking paint. Sweating in the heat, Ray pried it open with a crowbar and found stacks of old paperwork wrapped in plastic, as well as a small black flash drive nestled among them. The papers were mostly financial in nature, covered in official-looking stamps and signatures. He skimmed them. Invoices for maintenance projects, large sums paid out to contractors, addresses that matched homes in Crescent Pines. Yet the amounts seemed exaggerated, and the repeated references to community improvement fees struck him as odd. Then came the shocker. Some documents appeared to list payments from HOA members that were never officially recorded in the annual budget. He recognized certain addresses he'd seen on the neighborhood roster. These contributions were in the thousands of dollars, labeled as special fees or penalties waived. There were also mentions of an entity called CP Pro Services that Ray had never heard of, billing for phantom projects like median tree pruning or pond dredging. But Crescent Pines had no pond. Ray's heart pounded. This was evidence of fraud, possibly extortion, but the greatest surprise lay on the flash drive. He rushed inside, booted up his computer, and plugged it in. Folders labeled with cryptic names popped onto the screen. Each contained video files. Clicking on the first file, he saw surveillance footage of someone's living room, fuzzy black and white clips, as though recorded by a hidden camera. He recognized the occupant, a neighbor down the street, a man who lived alone and rarely spoke. Another folder was even more invasive, footage from a woman's kitchen capturing her daily routine. A third folder seemed to be a bedroom feed. Ray clicked out of it immediately, stomach churning. It was sickening. Whoever had planted these cameras, or whichever cameras these were, had been spying on unsuspecting residents. Jaw clenched, Ray stared at the rusted container. The presence of these documents and videos on his property was no accident. Someone had hidden them there, hoping they would stay buried. Or perhaps they intended to retrieve them under the cover of darkness. The incident with the power tool at his gate might have been an attempt to gain entry for that very purpose. By mid-afternoon, Ray was pacing in his living room, his thoughts spinning. The obvious first step was to hand everything to the police. He picked up his phone, scrolling to find the number for the county sheriff's department. Just before he pressed dial, the phone rang, making him jump. "Hello?" An anonymous voice, low, distorted, possibly through some filter, hissed into his ear. "Do you value your life, Holloway? Drop the drive and those papers. Act like you never saw them or you won't see tomorrow." Shaken, Ray managed to ask, "Who is this?" There was a click, then silence. He stood motionless, mind reeling. This was no petty HOA dispute. The documents suggested large-scale financial fraud. The videos hinted at a network of illegal surveillance, potential blackmail material, and Linda, who seemed to control everything in Crescent Pines, was likely complicit or at least aware of it. He knew the local police might be compromised, especially if they had close ties to the HOA. One of the older neighbors had once let slip that Linda often bragged about knowing how to handle cops, thanks to personal friendships. After that threatening call, Ray worried the local authorities could be part of the problem. In searching for solutions, a name came to mind: Lauren Bailey, an investigative journalist known statewide for uncovering political corruption. She had a reputation for thoroughness and for protecting her sources. Gathering the container and the flash drive, Ray packed them carefully, then looked up Lauren's contact info. He remembered reading her articles in the local press. She had toppled a corrupt city commissioner the previous year. The next afternoon, Ray drove an hour out of Crescent Pines to meet Lauren in a small diner off the highway. It felt safer to meet away from prying eyes. In a quiet booth, he passed her the container. She sifted through the paperwork, eyebrows knitted in concentration. Ray then handed her a USB with copies of the footage. He had made duplicates earlier just in case. Over coffee, she grilled him with precise questions. Who's Linda Hayward? How does the HOA function? Who are the possible higher-ups connected to these transactions? I'm not sure, Ray confessed. She's the president of the HOA. She claims a lot of authority, but what I've found indicates there's more going on, like an entire ring of people collecting money, forging documents, installing secret cameras. They might be blackmailing wealthy residents or using hush money for who knows what. Lauren jotted down everything in a worn spiral notebook. I'll verify these records, but from what I see, you're dealing with a pretty large conspiracy. If the wrong people find out you have this, you're in real danger. Ray let out a shaky breath. I've already had someone sabotage my gate and threaten me by phone. Lauren gave him a grim nod. You did the right thing coming to me, but you have to be cautious. Keep a low profile, and don't breathe a word to anyone until I can publish something substantial. If we go public before verifying, they'll just bury the story or spin it against you. He left the diner with mixed emotions, relieved to offload the evidence to a professional, yet anxious about the blowback that might come once the story broke. Over the next week, Lauren maintained contact with Ray, giving him updates. She had found a pattern of fraudulent billing across multiple addresses in Crescent Pines. Bank statements linked to certain contractors suggested shell companies. Even more disturbing, the flash drive contained footage from at least 10 different residences, some time-stamped as far back as 2 years. This was a systematic operation, not a one-off invasion of privacy. Lauren published her first expose online under the headline, "Hidden Cameras, Inflated Fees, Shocking Allegations Rock Crescent Pines HOA." The story spread quickly. Local news stations picked it up, and soon Linda Hayward's name was on every newscast in the region. A media firestorm descended upon Crescent Pines. Residents flocked to Ray's driveway, demanding answers, refusing to stay silent. Protests erupted in the small park near the gated entrance. People carried signs that read, "End HOA Tyranny" and "No More Spy Cams." Several emboldened neighbors came forward with testimonies of strange fees and intimidation tactics. One woman tearfully recounted how Linda forced her to pay thousands to avoid legal trouble over a minor landscaping dispute. Another man claimed his dog was threatened with removal unless he complied with arbitrary new guidelines. Under intense media pressure, the county sheriff's office finally issued a warrant for Linda's arrest. An evening news segment showed her being led away in handcuffs, face pale and resolute, as she insisted on her innocence. But as soon as she was in custody, Linda began naming names, members of the HOA board, local officials, even a few police officers who allegedly turned a blind eye. The scandal ballooned. Ray, watching from his living room, felt torn between satisfaction and fear. Satisfaction that Linda was facing consequences, fear that the network might extend beyond her. Lauren's subsequent reports revealed that individuals in local government positions had accepted bribes to overlook illegal surveillance. She published partial transcripts of Linda's statements, which implicated at least 2 city council members in profiting from Crescent Pines development deals. The story saturated every news channel. Outraged, the broader community demanded that the HOA be disbanded. People gathered outside City Hall, urging a full investigation into Crescent Pines' finances and management. More arrests followed, including a couple of prominent board members. A wave of relief swept through many homeowners as the oppressive regime crumbled practically overnight. During this period, Ray became an unlikely hero. Neighbors thanked him for exposing the scheme, for daring to stand up to Linda. They dropped off homemade meals, offered to help repaint his fence, or simply shook his hand in gratitude. Suddenly, the isolating power Linda once held was gone, replaced by communal support. Yet, Ray was still cautious. He slept lightly, woke at every unusual sound, and triple-checked his security cameras. Lauren's articles hinted at deeper layers to the conspiracy, with some powerful figures still unaccounted for. The media circus might be shining a spotlight on Crescent Pines, but shadows remained, and anything could lurk there. In the weeks that followed, the district attorney's investigation led to the official dissolution of the Crescent Pines HOA. A county judge ruled that the association, under Linda Hayward's leadership, had grossly violated residents' rights and engaged in criminal activity. As her testimony went on record, more arrests followed. A city planning official linked to shady development deals, a pair of compromised police officers, and several other HOA board members who had collaborated in the fraudulent schemes. With the corrupt structure dismantled, Crescent Pines entered a phase of renewal. Residents banded together to form an interim committee tasked with drafting fair, transparent rules that respected everyone's property rights. Gone were the days of heavy-handed fines and arbitrary demands. Flowers in front yards blossomed unimpeded. Children played in cul-de-sacs where tense stares once prevailed. Ray Holloway watched these transformations unfold with cautious optimism. Where once neighbors had kept their distance, they now worked side by side, repainting fences or organizing cleanup crews. The community spirit that Crescent Pines had promised finally became reality. Each homeowner's individuality flourished under common-sense guidelines, without fear of secret surveillance or retribution. Local news outlets followed the cleanup efforts and covered the fledgling democracy in Crescent Pines with interest. Their cameras showed volunteers setting up open-air meetings where every resident's opinion on landscaping or neighborhood safety was considered. People no longer tiptoed around Linda's whims. In fact, Linda was preparing her defense from a jail cell, facing charges of extortion and conspiracy. After helping to draft the new bylaws, Ray stepped away from any formal leadership role, content to remain a voice of experience rather than authority. He kept the documents and videos he had discovered stored in a safe place, just in case future inquiries required them as evidence. Yet he was finally able to enjoy the peaceful home life he had sought from the beginning. One late afternoon, he sat on his freshly painted porch, this time a shade he chose without any HOA interference, listening to the wind through the tall pines. In the distance, he could see neighbors chatting with genuine warmth instead of forced smiles. Smiling himself, Ray reflected on how much had changed in just a few months. The unity now binding the residents of Crescent Pines felt stronger than the fear that once stifled them. Though the weeks of conflict had tested everyone, the triumph of cooperation and integrity shone through. Linda and her co-conspirators were facing the legal consequences of their actions, and Crescent Pines was no longer under a toxic influence. Looking over his fence at the neighbor's yard, where a few kids played catch, Ray felt a calm satisfaction. At last, he had found the peaceful sanctuary he had been searching for. And in that sense of hard-won tranquility, the community truly stepped into a new era, one defined not by rigid control, but by respect, honesty, and a genuine spirit of neighborhood togetherness.